Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lenders Online Training, our live stream conversation, as you might know. I'm Dave Stauffacher. I'm the senior credit trainer with Lenders Online Training, where, as many of you know, we help lending and credit professionals say yes to good loans. So today, we're going to stray away from our usual format, that is responding to many of your questions that you've submitted over the months and years. And because we have a special guest today, her name is Sara Kraft. So whether you lead a credit team, you're managing analysts, or you sit at that approval chair, I'd like to think that today's actual conversation is probably something that's very interesting to you. I'm joined today by Sara Kraft. She's the principal consultant at Laurel Consulting. She's a commercial banking strategist. I guess we're going to have to focus on that word strategy, but she's a strategist. She's led credit teams. She's developed training programs. She's actually joined the ranks. She's kind of rolled up her sleeves, worked with bankers, lenders in the trenches, which I really like that. She brings a different perspective here, and I think it's something that we don't hear of, and I'm going to be a little biased here, that we don't hear enough of. It's what's breaking down the way our credit teams, the way they communicate, the way that the experienced analysts kind of go through the process, and sometimes they're just missing something. So Sara facilitates AnalytiQ. Now, something unique about that, it's with the Q. So I'm going to make sure that she talks about that during today's session. It's a training program for credit analysts that bridges the gap between, well, it's all about communication, the things that undermine our commercial process. And actually, that's what we're going to talk about today. 5 blind spots that kind of undermine the communication process that we deal with in credit. They're not exotic problems. They're kind of assumptions that are kind of in plain sight, but we just kind of don't think about. They actually resolve around communication. And some of you at Lenders Online Training know the fact that communication is one of those C's of credit that I bring up a lot. I think it's more than just the 5 C's. So it's how we interpret risk. It's actually how we frame the decisions with the people we talk with. And actually, it kind of gets into the issue of how the credit process sometimes just breaks down through information. Sara, I want to welcome you today, and thanks for joining us. So did I miss anything?
I don't think so. Thanks so much for the introduction. And I'm really excited to be here today. Glad that I ran across Lenders Online Training probably about 8 years ago. So your organization's been instrumental in helping the credit teams that I've worked with over the years in just getting that really solid credit foundation. And you're right, I built AnalytiQ to be a little bit different from that traditional credit training. We focus a lot on the numbers, and that's so critical. Don't underestimate or think that I'm underestimating that. But I wrote the AnalytiQ program to really complement that with a set of communication skills. And what should that look like for credit analysts? Everything from, how do we ask questions? What really is the purpose of the credit presentation? What are we writing for? And should we be writing differently to benefit that audience who's going to be the end user of our credit presentation?
Awesome. Well, as you know, we've talked a little bit earlier before this session today, and you know that I have a banking background. Now, it's a few years before me, but in my earlier days, and right now, because I work a lot with lenders and credit analysts, both with Lenders Online Training and my consulting practice that I work with. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion about blind spots. So are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay, let's work on one of the first blind spots. This one has some dearness to my heart. It's believing the numbers tell the story. So I want you to talk a little bit about that if I recall that, you talk about numbers, you talk about story in the presentation. Talk some more about that.
I think a lot of times the credit analyst, there's this huge stack of information in front of you, right? If it's written down or it's in files on your computer these days, but it's a lot of information, and we can easily start to perceive as analysts that I should be able to determine what the story is from those numbers. So maybe revenues went up by 10%. I can assume that that's a good thing, right? The up is the right direction we typically want. But what if I found out some more context, like they actually tried to double the size of their sales staff last year in the hopes that they could double revenues, but actually they achieved 10%. Now all of a sudden I'm maybe a little more concerned about about that. So we have, the numbers are simply facts. We need to give that some context. We need to carry it a little bit further to tell the story of, why is the number the way that it is, and should I be concerned about that or not? So we talk in analytic about the credit presentation really being a story supported by the numbers. So still absolutely critical that you understand your ratios, you understand where the numbers are coming from, what's good, what's potentially concerning, and to really tell the story then for your credit approval is where you're really adding value.
I love that. I mean, when I teach our Lenders Online training participants, I've always kind of put it in the context that the numbers that we look at, whether it's on a tax return, whether it's on a financial statement, they're just numbers, right? They are numbers that reflect something that happened. And this is the ironic part. We're looking at the information, maybe it's April, May, or during this time period, but we're looking at information that reflects numbers of 5 months ago, 10 months ago, a whole year prior. So what we're trying to do is how can we develop something between the numbers so that is relevance to our underwriters or our, process. Is that correct?
Foundationally, we believe that historical numbers should somehow give us some hints about what's going to be happening in the future. So using words effectively to tell the story rather than maybe a recitation of the numbers is where you're really elevating your game in the credit analyst world.
Yeah, what I like about that is interesting. When we talk about, we often look at things historically speaking as a bank underwriter. We're basically going through, evaluating the numbers. But sometimes there's the issue of looking forward, using the numbers as a point of pivot for many of our clients to say, all right, this is what happened, but notice they did this in strategy. So now all of a sudden you're actually adding context to numbers as to what management did, which I think would be a good sign when we're underwriting the credit that, all right, things didn't go as well, but this is what they did and changed the numbers.
Correct. Just it all comes down to context. I think that might be our word of the day here today in our conversation. But that is the value that credit analysts add to this process that isn't replaced by artificial intelligence, by our more sophisticated software systems that we have today. And as an analyst, you're not going to know that information innately simply by looking at a tax return. You're going to have to ask some questions. You're going to have to be part of a conversation with the borrower, figuring out how to go about that information gathering so that you can obtain the story is critical as well.
In your bio that I was talking about, you mentioned that you actually were in the trenches. What did you learn from that, and how can that help some of our analysts or bankers in developing context?
So in one of the training programs actually that I developed, it was actually a 2-day session on writing better credit presentations. And as part of that, we spent quite a bit of time talking with credit approvers. After all, they're the end users of the presentation. And I see this in a lot of organizations where approvers, either approve a credit or they ask for some revisions, but there's not always a strong feedback loop between the approver and the credit analyst, who then can learn from and level up their work from there. So I like to have credit analysts sitting in on any committee that they could, just to hear what those conversations were, so that they're having that interaction and really understanding what their audience needs are. And I think that was how I, stopping to reconsider and reframe with a different perspective was really valuable for me.
I love that. I love that. All right, let's move on to blind spot number 2. Stopping at observation instead of interpretation. Talk to me more about this one.
This is my way of saying, please stop with the elevator analysis. and a lot of us have heard of that. And for those who haven't, elevator analysis is when we stop at saying revenues went up, gross profit margin was down, cost of goods sold was up. We're just talking about what goes up and down like an elevator, and we're not talking about why, and we're not talking about whether an approver should care or not. interpretation really requires that we ask some more questions. I can't simply look at that number and make an assumption about whether that's good or bad. And David, we used an example, you used an example in our earlier conversation about golf. I shot a 74 in my last round of golf. To me, that sounds amazing. But if David is a seasoned golfer or just finished up at the Masters, maybe that was a rough day for him. I need more context. I needed David to tell me, is that good, or is that something to be concerned about? So getting that context, I love the phrase "tell me more." When I ask a lender a question, or when you're asking a borrower a question, maybe they answer your question and you've got that, yes, no type answer. But when I stop and say, tell me more, and give someone the chance to further elaborate, I will always get better information, and often coming from, information I wasn't anticipating before, that I wouldn't have gotten if I would have just moved on with the conversation. So that's one of my tricks for just being able to get that additional context, to add nuance to my story, is simply asking the lender, the borrower, if I have that opportunity. So tell me more about that.
I like that. A good friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, kind of used that in his explorer technique. He would basically say, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Or could you rephrase that a little bit differently so I can understand that? So what we really want to do is we want to listen. We want to absorb whatever insight that can be shared so we can frame up the right thing.
Absolutely. And I've also found that that's a great example, because if I don't fully understand something, saying, tell me more, can you say some more about that? Buys you some additional time to, gives them another chance to rephrase it in a way that that you might better understand as well.
And I would say sometimes as a consultant in whatever practice that you're doing, many times our clients probably are not, we want to get them to the layer that really is the issue, or something that really is what we're pinpointing. They're just not there yet. And I think that's really defining and getting a better understanding of the whole setting as a banker or an underwriter, what's really going on here. So,
and when you've reached that interpretation level, you're able to answer the question, why, and why should I care? Like those are good benchmarks, I think, for analysts to, as you're reviewing your narrative, have I included this information? Did I understand this to the level that I can confidently, document? Why did that happen? And, why should I care? And if in reviewing that, you realize it really doesn't matter all that much, then that's great content to, take out, to thin out your presentation, make the rest of it more effective.
Perfect. All right. 2 down. How about blind spot number 3? Writing for yourself instead of the approver. This is going to be good.
I'm guilty of this myself as a credit analyst, because why shouldn't my very best work product be, helpful and beneficial to an approver? And I mentioned this earlier, but when I was putting together this 2-day session on writing a stronger credit presentation narrative, I came to the realization that, I can put paragraph after paragraph and long sentences and, a very university sounding vocabulary. But actually, my credit approvers are often, they're often reading presentations in the evening on their own personal time. If they're getting ready for a committee, our committees were always on Tuesday morning, and one approver confessed to me that like Monday Night Football doubled as their time to get up to speed on presentations. So what I realized from that is, wow, I need to make this easier for someone to be able to understand by skimming it, by, they're going to hone in on, a certain risk or a certain concern that they have, but I want them to be able to find the information they need easily. So that might mean more bulleted lists. That definitely means I need to reduce word count. The goal here is, I'm not paid by the word as a credit analyst. I can make that paragraph shorter and more succinct. And that's actually going to help my overall message carry through and be more clear.
I find that interesting with writing. Many times, you have people that struggle with writing. I get that. I would probably put myself in that kind of bucket. There's those that are very fluent in writing and very creative in their writing. So their business plans or their write-ups for loans get to be just long. I'm trying to find a happy medium because I think you made a good point. When reviewers are actually crashing, they're busy all day, but they have a loan committee the next day. They have to go through this stuff pretty quickly. It is, I think it's probably common sense that many of us skim through it. We want to get to the financials. We want to see what, are they, that's where our intent of our questions are going to focus on. But if we can break it down and hit the highlights to kind of develop the story as a little paragraph, but bullet points that are key things that are drawing up, or as we say in Lenders Online Training, red flags, certain issues that we know people's eyes are going to look on, we got the answers to that.
In high school and college, we all had to write papers that were, 8 pages, double spaced, 10-point font. You had to hit a certain length. And in the business world, it's pretty much the opposite. The more succinct, the more concise you can be, the better. In Analytic, one of the things we do is we put a sample of our own writing. Everybody pulls something from their own, a credit presentation they've recently worked on. We put it through Microsoft Word. There are some editor features within Microsoft Word, including there's a feature in there called the Flesch Kincaid score, which gives your writing a grade level. It assigns a grade level to what you've written. And the target we're typically looking for in good credit analysis would be about grade 11, which is about what the Wall Street Journal is written at. Okay. Most people find that they're like 14 to 16 is where they're scoring out, and then they can actively do some things to make their writing a little more readable. It's a little bit shorter sentences. It's getting rid of some like prepositional phrases that aren't really doing anything other than taking up space in your sentences. Some little tricks like that, which don't sound like they would be directly related to credit analysis, but I guarantee you, if you read a credit presentation that grades out a 15 versus an 11, you're going to see a remarkable difference and ease in ability to read and understand that just isn't there in the more complex writing. But this is counter to what we were taught in school when we learned how to write. So.
No, interesting. And I've seen the evolution of a lot of write-ups over the years as how they become more succinct. Some of my banks that I even fortunately work with, some are very brief. And I'm thinking there's maybe it's part of their discussion and I'm just missing it. I'm just reading that. Hopefully there is, but I appreciate that.
One more thing about brief that I will just mention is it's very easy for analysts to assume that if they get a question coming out of a credit presentation, that just because there was a question that there was something missing in the credit presentation. And I would just encourage analysts, ask an approver if you aren't sure. Like, was this really a miss that should have been in the presentation? Were you asking this for another reason? Sometimes approvers are asking questions simply because it would be awkward not to. Like they want to have some interaction. Maybe they want to know, how deep your understanding is of the credit, but it doesn't immediately imply that like your goal is not to never have a question or interaction in a credit presentation. And that's a tricky spot to try to navigate as a credit analyst. But when you're not sure, I would encourage analysts to simply ask, like, should this have been documented? I'm happy to learn that and grow from it and build on it. But if it's not critical to the presentation, then let's have that interaction, ask a question, and we'll all move on.
Awesome.
That's a tough spot for analysts to navigate.
Yeah, and I think our analysts that are listening here today would appreciate that. Well, that you may not have all the answers, and you don't have to necessarily feel you have to have all the answers. But if a question comes up, it might be a great learning period, and you just ask. And maybe it was just something that came out of the air, and they're just trying to define something. You had the answer. And I think what I've often told some credit analysts, if you don't know, tell them, say, that's a good question. I don't know right now. And you get back to them. Just being transparent and honest, I think that's great as well.
Far better than trying to make up an answer or try to hide the fact that you're not certain.
We've been in meetings where that's come up before. I get that. All right, let's move on to blind spot number 4. Assuming that the analyst's role is static. Explain about that.
Couple different angles at this one. So the first is that, there's this stereotype about the analyst. You can be there with your pile of paper and just crank out credit analysis in your little corner. And I'm an analyst because I don't like to talk to people. I hear that all the time. I have bad news. We're gonna have to interact with others to really be successful in our job, to be able to gather that story that we're not going to be able to obtain from the tax returns, from the financials. Analysis is always stronger with that interaction. In many institutions, and in most that I work with, that interaction is typically with a lender. It's not necessarily directly with the borrower, but I'm sure there are some portfolio managers on who are listening to this, that who do have that responsibility for credit analysis and borrower interaction as well. The other way that I look at this analyst role being more dynamic than static is when I look at just what the role of the credit analyst is today versus 20 years ago when I started in the industry as a credit analyst. My job role just, it looked different. Spreading software didn't do all that it can do today. There weren't end-to-end systems that are quite as robust as many that are out there today. The tax code has only gotten more complicated and trying to keep up with those rules. And now we have AI tools that feel like they could storm in any minute and start to take over a lot of roles. And analysts we need a different type of training for the role that we have today. That value add that we're providing in credit analysis is bridging between the numbers and the story and putting that all together into an effective analysis document. ChatGPT is never going to be able to explain that 10% revenue increase was actually, potentially a concern because of how much, had been invested in growth prior to that. Or whatever, the real story actually is in that instant. 10% growth might have been outstanding results for a company who, lost its largest client, but was able to replace that business and continue to grow. So the analyst as storyteller, I think, is really what is differentiating the credit analyst role as being unique and not replaceable in the same way. So with these different tools that we have today, yes, our basic foundation in cash flow analysis and ratio analysis is still critical, but a lot of the important work that we're doing today is much more around, telling that story, monitoring for that risk, watching for change, just because we have so many different tools out there.
You brought up a point there that I wanted to touch on. I was going to touch on a little bit later, but I think this is a good time to bring it up. You brought up ChatGPT. You brought up AI. Now, this is an interesting dynamic that it's developing. It's around us today. Many times you will hear that if you don't get on board, you're going to be passed by with it. And many of the banks that I've talked to, because it's in the institutional world that I also spend a lot of time with, but in the banking world, it's been a little bit of a cautious step over as to how do we let that come into the bank environment. And I think where I want to go with this, as the analysts or the bankers, can we be comfortable with AI, and where could we utilize it in doing our write-ups or doing something other than here's all my financials and spread them, but can you do something else with AI? I'm curious.
Well, a lot of institutions are still exploring this, if I'm being, especially in this credit analyst world. There's a lot of information that crosses our desks that, if entered into AI for, simply, make this more concise, for example, could be can be private information that we wouldn't want out there. So there are some institutions using certain platforms that, my understanding is, and I'm far from an expert in the AI world, but Copilot is one that I've heard some institutions using because I think they feel like there's a little better cushion around, being able to isolate information within their organization. But certainly, borrower member information specifically, I'd certainly be hesitant. And in my consulting practice as well, I have to be really diligent about, what's going into those systems. What am I telling it, for its memory banks? But by the same token, there are systems, some of the spreading and credit presentation softwares out there are starting to build AI elements into their systems as well. And so, my assumption there is that there's some guardrails around that, being within that system. But that's certainly a conversation to have within your organization. Hopefully, organizations are, your risk department is developing or has developed an AI policy. The question comes up in many circles around credit analysis in the commercial lending world, where I'd say that this industry is slower adopter than many, but I think with very good reason. We need to be really careful about what we're putting into these systems, how we're using these tools. But we also need to know that even as organizations who maybe lock down access to those systems, there's still that opportunity there's still other ways that employees can access that information as well.
I think that's a fabulous response, and I appreciate of you. I mean, we're going a little bit off our topic there to get into that, but I think it is kind of an issue there, and I think it's an important, whether it's a blind spot that we exist today. That now I will admit, for AI purposes, is I'm a taker of AI. In other words, I want to get it out of there to ask it questions to learn more, rather than uploading and here, can you rewrite this better? Can you spread this? I'd rather, because there's so much information, even in our write-ups, as to common pitfalls, common industry trends, certain things that we as lenders, it might help us as our underwriting performance, and say, you know what, I learned a couple of things that these are potential things I want to ask my clients. But yeah.
Certainly. Yes. That's a good example as well. So I think it's good conversations to, within your teams, in your organizations. I think if your organization isn't talking about it, you probably should be. And I think the questions are more than fair. And even if there's not an immediate solution, let's figure out a path toward that, so that we can all, ignoring it is not going to make it go away. Mm-hmm. I think it probably puts us in a better position to at least explore what our parameters are or should be within our organizations.
Excellent. I appreciate it. Okay, our last blind spot today is underestimating the importance of understanding the full loan process. Mm-hmm. Where do we go with this one?
Well, so when I worked in a bank for about 15 years, I moved to a credit union where I really got to start a commercial lending department with a couple of lenders. And in that, when I moved to that new organization, I would get questions once in a while about deals, as they continue to progress, that had already been approved. And I used to joke that, well, the deal got approved, so it's dead to me now. Like, I'm on to the next thing, and that's somebody else's job, right? But the reality is, when having that familiarity with what else is going on in the commercial loan cycle, who else is doing it, what's being done. It's critical to know where you fit in as the credit analyst, as well as give you some insights and maybe empathy for what the other roles in the commercial process are doing. And here's an example of that in analytic. We talked about this in week 1. It was one of our kind of level setting topics, is looking at the big picture of credit analysis. And I had this graphic that I had put together, and it depicts the commercial lending process essentially as a figure 8. And on one loop of the figure 8 is kind of that loan origination process, which is starting with prospecting and moving along through loan closing. And then it goes over to this side, which is your portfolio management, which is your annual review cycle. And if something happened, maybe there's a new loan request, we go back over into the origination cycle. But that was how I turned that into a figure 8. And an analyst sent me an email after class and said, thanks for putting that graphic together. I thought I really understood what the whole process was, but I never really stopped to realize that prospecting is where this all starts. Like, for me, the loan begins when I get this set of terms and, information to start a credit presentation, but I never really took the time to think through, the lender prospected to find this loan opportunity, and maybe they did that for a year or two before, they actually got all the information and that opportunity. And that gives me a new appreciation for, my partner, and that, I wouldn't have loans to underwrite if I didn't have that lending partner. But now I understand a bit more about what they're going through, and that their only priority is not, getting this one particular loan through, but they have this whole ecosystem of loans they're working on at any point in time. And the same is true for your loan processor, who is, working the deal both before and after you as a credit analyst, to get, all the details in order so that we can get to a loan closing and have everything that we that we need in order to do so. So I encourage the attendees to, take some time that week to have a conversation with someone else in the process. And the feedback that I got from them about, just being asked the question of what's easy about, what's easy for you to accomplish in your work and what's more challenging. And maybe there's an easy way that I could help make something challenging a little bit easier. But if nothing else, I can have a greater appreciation for the work that you're doing and how my work fits into that bigger cycle overall.
Definitely kudos to the loan processors. Now, we probably don't have any loan processors on today's session, but credit analysts, bankers, just say thank you to your loan processors. They
they're the Swiss Army knives.
Oh my goodness, they put it all together. We kind of get the glory. We're at the table, the signatures. Yeah. I get that, but they do so much work in making sure all those documents seem to go together, that all the mailing addresses work, all the they just have to, that they're appreciated. So kudos to them. And so analysts, bankers, just say thank you to them. That's be awesome.
In all of my years working in this process, and I've been in all of the different chairs of the commercial lending process, but it becomes easy to feel like these work groups are a little bit working against each other, right? You have the lender who wants to get the deal done and it has to close on Thursday, and you have your analyst who is, has some questions about the numbers, and you have your processor who needs this list of information. It's easy to feel like there is some friction there. Yep. But when we stop to realize, actually we're all on the same team. We're looking at this from different perspectives, and those different perspectives are very intentionally designed to protect our institutions, to ensure that our loans are getting put on the books, are being monitored appropriately. Those different perspectives, I think, only strengthen our decisions when we work together. I see this with lenders and analysts a lot, but this starts with a lender who most likely has had some conversations with a company owner, and maybe they've been in person, maybe they've been on the phone, but then the lender gets this stack of paper, and what do they do with it? Or they get files, they drop it off with the analyst, and then the analyst doesn't have the benefit of that conversation. They just have a stack of financials. It shouldn't come as a huge surprise to us that we're going to maybe see different things. The lender has, one impression based on this conversation. And, the analyst has their, conclusions and a list of questions from looking at documents. Now we need to come together and figure out, where do we see agreement and where do we need to maybe iron out some details. But at the end of the day, we're on the same page. We're talking about the same situation. It just looks different because our source of information was very different.
Awesome. This has been a great discussion. Hopefully all our listeners appreciated the fact and something a little bit different, and that what Sarah's been able to do. Did we miss anything, or is there something you would like to add?
No, I think thinking about our communication skills, and it's something that feels like it should be innate for all of us. But the reality is we can all be challenged to think a little bit differently about how we communicate, maybe some best practices, maybe some strategies we can employ to get better answers to our questions, or to know that there might be that potential friction with our teammates, but how in reality can we maybe put ourselves in their shoes for a minute and look at things from a different perspective and come to some different understanding. And even though we have different perspectives, we can still collaborate really effectively together.
Awesome. That's a great message. So how can our followers connect with you?
Certainly. So I do have a website for analytics specifically. It's AnalytiQ with a Q at the end, -training.com. And then feel free to also connect with me if someone has questions or just wants to continue the conversation. Can also reach my email which is sara.kraft@laurelpeakconsulting.com. So would love to just hear your thoughts, and I will be offering future sessions of analytic as well. I don't have anything on calendars at the moment, but it's essentially structured, very similar to Lenders Online Training, an hour a week over the course of 6 weeks. with a focus really on, those weeks in between. You don't have specific homework, but we're doing, hey, here are, find a paragraph, an opportunity where you can turn a paragraph into a bulleted list that makes it a little bit easier for your readers. So really, simple tasks like that can allow for some carryover between what we talk about in class and how you put those skills into action right away.
That's awesome. Well, today, everyone, we recognize our lenders, our analysts, they face a lot of pressure to deal with things fast. They have to make confident lending decisions. And my goodness, navigating the tax returns, the financial statements, and just the regulations that we deal with, it can be very difficult. We take pride of ourselves here at Lenders Online Training. Our online courses focus on tax returns. They focus on financial statements and even focus on commercial real estate, as we're going to be developing, as that new course is going to be coming out. Just a little bit of a plug there. We want to make sure that your team feels confident, that they have a clear understanding of what their analysis is. They feel good in conversation. They're looking to do good things for their borrowers, but they're confident that when they present to their committees. We think foundational training is important. It's step-by-step, practical tools. You get to meet with people like myself, Joe, Linda. We want our lenders to feel confident when they're talking to their peers and representing their clients. So check us out at lendersonlinetraining.com. Check us out. Lastly, as you know, I always close out with this. We love to hear the questions from you. That's kind of why we've done these live streams, the questions and comments that you've asked. Joe and I and Linda love to be able to answer those. So please keep sending those in. That's at experts@lendersonlinetraining.com. Again, if you have any questions specific to Sara, please reach out and check with her. I think it was a wonderful conversation today. I learned a lot. It's been a very rewarding conversation, and feel free to reach her out as well. So I want to thank you all for coming, and we will look to connect with you soon. So see you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.